April 1943. The North African desert stretched endlessly beneath them, a sea of golden silence. From 20,000 feet, the land looked dead. But for those inside the battered British bomber, death was anything but still. The engines coughed unevenly, one sputtering like a dying heartbeat. The cockpit trembled under every shudder of metal and wind. A smell of burnt oil filled the narrow fuselage, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. Flight Lieutenant James Hurley gripped the controls with both hands, his knuckles pale and trembling. Sweat mixed with the fine red dust clinging to his face. Behind him, the intercom hissed in bursts of static. "Starboard engines hit, sir," came a voice, hoarse, urgent.
"We're losing pressure!"
Halley didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked across the shattered dials before him. The altimeter was dead, the compass needle spun like a drunk man on a carousel, and the glass of the artificial horizon was spider, webbed with cracks. The instruments, his lifeline, were gone. Outside, the morning light had turned cruel, burning white across the sand. The sky was empty now, the German fighters long vanished into the haze. They had struck fast and hard, leaving the bomber limping, half blind, and far from home. "Keep it steady," Halley muttered, though even he could hear the strain in his voice. "We'll find a way." But deep down, he knew they were flying blind. The crew of 5 moved like ghosts through the fuselage. Each man knew his role, but the rhythm of flight, the sure confidence of direction, had vanished. Sergeant Allen, the navigator, hunched over his table of maps. Ink smeared, sweat dripping onto the parchment. "We've lost radio fix. Last position, somewhere south of Tobruk. Maybe 100 miles inland." "Maybe." The gunner barked, disbelief cutting through the roar of the engines. "Compass is shot," Allen said quietly. "We're turning circles, and don't even know it." Halley said nothing. The only sound was the steady thrum of air pushing through torn metal, the faint metallic rattle of loose bolts. Somewhere behind them, fuel leaked in a slow, steady hiss, a reminder that time was running out. They had taken off before dawn. A reconnaissance mission over German supply lines. The flight out had been smooth, the return deadly. The first burst of flak had ripped through the fuselage like claws through cloth. The second had found the cockpit. Shrapnel had caught Halley in the face, just a fragment, but enough to burn across his cheek and blind his left eye with blood. He could still see, barely, through the right. Enough to fly. Enough to hope. "Sir." Allen's voice came again, quieter now. "We've maybe 30 minutes of fuel. If we don't find a heading soon," the sentence died there. Halley's mind refused to finish it. He looked down through the cracked glass at the desert below, dunes rolling endlessly, like waves frozen in time. No roads, no landmarks, no salvation. Only the sun hanging fierce and low over the western sky. The bomber dipped slightly. A faint alarm wailed, useless, meaningless. Halley adjusted the throttle with a shaking hand, trying to balance the dead weight of the failing engine. Every adjustment felt like guesswork, like steering through fog without a compass. "Can we still reach base?" Someone shouted over the noise. Halley hesitated. "If we can find it." A bitter laugh came from the rear. "That's a big if." The cockpit fell silent again. Outside, the light was changing, the brilliance of day softening toward the harsh gold of late afternoon. Shadows stretched across the dunes. It was beautiful, in a cruel sort of way. A beauty reserved for those with nothing left to lose. Inside, the heat was suffocating. The thin metal skin of the aircraft turned the cabin into an oven. Sweat pooled under collars, dripped onto controls. Every breath tasted of oil, dust, and fear. Halley's vision blurred. He blinked hard once, twice, then again. His right eye burned from the effort. He thought of home, Green Hills rain, the quiet hum of his father's workshop. He had once built telescopes there, grinding mirrors by hand. He remembered the way sunlight bent across a polished surface, how a single angle could change everything. That thought drifted away as quickly as it came, buried under the weight of noise and exhaustion. "Sir, fuel's down to the last tank," Allen called. Halley leaned forward, scanning the skies for anything, coastline, mountain ridge, smoke, anything to tell them where they were. But the horizon offered nothing but desert and glare. He wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. The gesture left a streak of red across his face, a mark of both survival and defeat. "Try the radio again," he ordered. The operator shook his head. "Antenna's gone. It's just static. Keep trying." He knew it was hopeless, but the sound of effort, the crackle of radio static, felt better than silence. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost meaning somewhere between the explosions and the endless hum of flight. The bomber lurched suddenly, a violent shudder that threw Halley forward against the control column. A burst of smoke filled the cabin. One of the engines coughed, spat black flame, and went quiet. He felt the plane tilt, losing altitude fast. "Feathering prop," he shouted, fighting the controls. The bomber groaned in protest, its frame trembling as if alive. They were falling, not fast enough to panic, but just enough to feel the weight of gravity return. Outside, the sand drew closer. "Hold her," Alan cried. "Hold her steady!" Halley pulled back, muscles straining. The horizon leveled, barely. The bomber steadied at a lower altitude, the engines whining like wounded animals. A murmur of relief rippled through the crew, but it was thin, fragile. The light shifted again. The sun, once a curse, now seemed almost merciful, casting long rays through the shattered cockpit glass. They struck the broken instruments, scattering in small, dancing reflections across the cabin. One of those glints caught Halley's good eye. It flashed off a shard of mirror near the navigation panel, a piece of glass from a shattered periscope mount, catching the sunlight at just the right angle. For a brief moment, he saw something strange. The reflection moved as he adjusted the plane's heading, and for a heartbeat, it felt consistent. Fixed, he blinked, uncertain. The light shimmered again, tracing a pattern across the wall. "Alan," he called slowly. "You said we lost the compass." "Total failure." Halley nodded absently. "Then we still have the sun." Alan frowned. "Sir?" "The sun doesn't fail," Halley said quietly. "Not unless the world stops turning." The navigator stared, puzzled, but Halley's gaze was locked on that sliver of glass, that glint of possibility. He leaned closer, watching how the reflection shifted as the aircraft turned. It wasn't random. The light moved predictably, tied to the sun's arc. He remembered something his father once told him. A mirror doesn't lie. It only tells you what's there, if you know how to read it. The words struck him now with the weight of revelation. Below them, the desert stretched infinite and cruel. Inside, hope was a dying ember. But in that fleeting flash of sunlight, a thought took root. He didn't know it yet, but that reflection, that one surviving sliver of glass, would become the key to their survival. Halley sat back in silence. The engines still trembled, the radio still dead. But somewhere in his mind, gears began to turn. He looked again at the sun, blazing steady through the dust. And as the compass spun uselessly beside him, he whispered, almost to himself, "The only thing that still obeys the laws of nature is the sun." Late afternoon thickened into that harsh North African glow where heat turns the horizon to glass. Inside the cockpit, the air vibrated with engine tremor and the dry rasp of wind. Halley steadied his breathing, the taste of metal on his tongue, the cut on his cheek tightening as it dried. He lowered his gaze to the sliver of mirror wedged near the navigation panel, a shard no larger than a postage stamp, edges dusted with grit, face mottled but bright where the sun struck it clean. The reflection slid across the panel with every tremble of the aircraft. Yet when he nudged the yoke, the gleam returned to the same line along the cracked frame. It was faint. It was stubborn. He lifted his wrist. The RAF watch still ticked. Second-hand stutter, minute-hand sure. Time meant the sun had a place in the sky, and the sun's place meant direction, if a man could fix it to something that would not lie. He took a breath thick as warm smoke and wiped a clear patch on the metal frame with his cuff. "Grease pencil," he said, voice hoarse. "Alan, pass it." A hand appeared at his shoulder, veins raised, knuckles blackened. The pencil felt soft, almost waxen, from the heat. He pressed the tip to the frame and drew a single line where the light cut true. Not elegant, not straight. Enough. "Sir." Alan's voice hovered, careful. "What are you doing?" "Keeping the sun where it belongs." He eased the yoke a hair to port. The reflection drifted off the mark, a bright fish slipping from a net. He corrected. Fractional pressure with 2 fingers, and the light settled back onto the line he had drawn. The plane steadied. For a moment, it felt like standing on a narrow ledge and finding the first sure footprint. It was nothing like a compass. It did not tell him which way was north or south. It told him only this: if the sun was falling toward his right shoulder, and the gleam held to that mark, then their nose pointed somewhere consistent. If he held it there long enough, consistency might become a heading, and a heading might become home. The engines complained. The dead propeller out on the wing turned into a dull disc, wind milling uselessly. Somewhere in the fuselage a loose panel rattled like teeth. "Fuel," he called. "Low," came the answer. "Too low. Then we don't waste turns, we don't hunt, we hold." He wasn't sure they could. But certainty was a luxury he could no longer afford. The crew worked in murmurs, the way men whisper in churches and field hospitals. The radio operator kept trying the broken set, tapping the housing with a knuckle, as if scolding it back to life. The gunner watched the barren sky through clouded plexiglass, scanning for specks that might mean fighters. Alan hovered at the navigator's table, pencil over crumpled maps that had stopped making sense the moment the compass died. Halley drew a second mark beneath the first. If the angle of the light shifted with the sun's drop, the gleam would slide from one line to the other at a steady rate. He did not need the name of the angle. He needed the rhythm. He watched. 10 slow breaths counted in his head. The light crept down the frame, as fragile and faithful as a minute hand. He touched the yoke. The gleam steadied. The plane steadied with it. So Alan tried again, softer now. "You think you can steer us on that pinprick?" "I've seen men steer whole heavens by smaller things," Halley said. He surprised himself with the calm in his own voice. "Hold the fuel flow where it is. Trim for endurance. We make the sun do the work." A beat of silence followed. Then Alan, almost a whisper, "Aye." They were still too high for details, too low for mercy. The dunes made long, slanting shadows. Occasional black scars in the sand hinted at wrecks, burned-out machines no one had bothered burying. The world felt ancient, and they felt temporary inside it. Sweat stung Halley's good eye. He blinked, and the image of his father's workshop returned, chalk dust in the air, the chime of glass, the careful patience of angles. "Light does what it must," his father had said once, cupping a small mirror so sunlight travelled across the bench like a living thing. "If you want truth, ask light. It can't pretend." He pressed the pencil again, firming the first mark. The tip broke. He flipped it and carried on. There was no way to measure miles. There was only the counting of breath, and the counting of seconds, and the stubborn belief that if they flew straight enough for long enough, the world would give them a sign. Behind him, the radio crackled and died. The operator swore into the handset and then, because he had to do something, began again. The bomber dipped without warning, a tired animal buckling at the knees. Halley corrected, the gleam leaping, then settling. His hands had learned the new grammar fast. "Do not chase the horizon, chase the light. Keep her smooth," the gunner murmured not unkindly. "She's an old girl. Likes to be asked, not told." "Then we'll ask," Halley said. The next minutes passed like hours, but they were not empty. The glow moved. The lines earned their keep. The aircraft fell into a quiet, grudging obedience. Like a wounded horse that still knows the path home because hooves have learned it, step after step. A faint band of haze appeared far ahead, lower than cloud. It darker than desert. It could be nothing. It could be everything. It could be the breath of cooler air above sea. Or a mirage that would pull them onward only to break their hearts. "Do you see it?" Alan asked. "I see something." He did not let his voice make a promise it could not keep. "Hold the mark. Fatigue comes in layers, first the muscles, then the eyes. Then the part of the mind that makes the next decision." Halley felt each peel away, leaving bone and will. The cut on his cheek throbbed with every bump. His shoulders burned. A trickle of blood had dried beneath his ear. A thin seam he could feel whenever he turned his head. He moved anyway. A man does not consult his pain when other men's lives are on the line. He glanced at his watch. The second hand kept faith. The angle of the sunlight had lowered since his first mark. He drew a third, lower still, then a short tick beside it. A scale born from desperation. "Sir," the engineer said from the hatchway, voice thin with heat. "We've got maybe 20, 30 minutes on this tank if we're lucky." "Then our luck is punctual," Halley replied. "We'll meet it on the line." The engineer gave a small, dry laugh. One nudged the wounded plane. Desert thermals rose like ghosts. Each time the nose drifted, the gleam betrayed it. Each time Halley brought it back. Not with the wide corrections of a man who has sky to waste, but with the small, careful hands of a craftsman at a lathe. The crew began to breathe with him. Their chests rose and fell to the pace of his tiny adjustments. The aircraft's pulse and the men's pulse cinched. Fear did not leave them, but it learned the rhythm too. "Tell me a story," the gunner said suddenly, maybe to keep the dark from filling the cabin. Halley kept his eyes on the mark. Once there was a boy who thought mirrors were magic. His father told him the magic wasn't in the mirror. It was in the truth that light doesn't lie. And did the boy believe him? "Not at first," Halley said. "He wanted magic. Truth is harder work." The gunner exhaled, a sound like relief and grief tangled together. "Well, take either today." The haze ahead thickened. The line of horizon lost the bleached sharpness of sand meeting sky. It blurred, like a pencil smudge across a ruler. The kind of blur a man gets when air grows damp. The kind of blur that says water. "Don't you dare be a trick," Alan whispered to the world beyond the glass. A soft shiver ran through the skin of the plane. The temperature felt less like an oven and more like a kiln left to cool. Halley smelled something different in the air. Still mostly oil, metal, sweat, but with a faint ghost beneath it, a memory of mornings by the coast. The light slid to the lowest mark. He made a fourth. The pencil was a nub now, his fingertips sticky with grace and graphite. The shard of mirror vibrated in a precise halo, sending its flare onto the new tick, as if relieved to find it waiting. 10 minutes, the engineer called. Maybe 15. The radio operator stopped tapping. The set had fallen silent in a way even stubbornness could not challenge. He rested his forehead against the panel for a heartbeat, then lifted it. "Still here," he said to no one in particular. "I'm still here." The first gull would have been too much to ask. There were no birds this deep inland. But the sky changed color by a shade. The pale above them turned a little more honest, a little less merciless. The sun hung lower, licking the edge of the world with an orange not seen over sand alone. Halley's throat tightened. He did not smile. You do not smile at hope when men are listening. You escorted and quietly, as if it were shy and might bolt. "Hold," he said, no chatter. "Hold," the bomber droned. A seam in the floor clicked softly with each small vibration. A screw rolled in a slow circle under the navigator's table, like a planet with a tired orbit. Somewhere aft, someone began a prayer and then forgot the words, letting breath take their place. The reflection slipped again, thinner now, as the sun's edge approached the world's. Halley's knuckles whitened. He held the mark with the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a man who has had to learn patience to survive. 5 minutes. The engineer warned, voice hushed, as if loud sound could break the balance. Then a line appeared, horizontal, darker than sky, lighter than land. It ran from far left to far right, and for a second it could have been a trick of heat or a smear on glass. But it held. It held as the plane moved. It held as Halley blinked hard to clear the sting. It held as the crew leaned forward as one creature. "Tell me what you see," Halley said, not trusting his own hunger for it. "An edge," Alan breathed. "Sweet Lord, an edge." The gunner pressed his forehead to the plexiglass. "Say," he said. The word sounded like a drink of cold water. "That's sea." Halley did not let the yoke wander. He did not chase joy. He put the gleam back on the line and trimmed the power, and spoke to the engineer without moving his gaze. "Nurse what we've got. She comes down over water, we're dead. She comes down over land, we've got a fighting chance." "Eh," the engineer said, and the word was a promise and a plea. The horizon darkened, drawing its straight breath across the world. The sun's disk fattened, reddened, slipped closer to that stroke. The reflection on the frame thinned to a knife edge. The mark held. The aircraft obeyed. 2 minutes, the engineer said. "No lies left." Hallie's voice found a steadiness he did not feel. Listen to me. If we lose her, we stay with her as long as she glides. No sharp turns, no heroics. We make every yard count. We aim for Earth. The crew answered with the small sounds of men readying themselves, belts tightened, straps checked, hands found purchase. There were no speeches. Speeches belong to the living. The radio operator lifted the dead handset one last time, as if the act itself could send a message the air would understand we tried. Hallie watched the light carve itself into nothing. At the last possible instant before it vanished, it found his lowest mark and winked there, perfect as a signature. The nose moved through a pocket of cooler air. The slight lift tasted like mercy. Fool, he said. Fumes came back, just fumes. The sun's rim kissed the dark line. The sky and sea pretended they were the same thing. Hold, Hallie whispered, to the plane, to the light, to his hands. They held. The engine coughed once, a dry bark, and settled back into its exhausted drone. The bomber crawled forward like a man inches from a door. A faint, low band appeared beneath the line. A grey-brown smear that gathered shape as they closed, dunes flattened by wind, then a wash of darker earth, then, there, threads of scrub. Land between desert and sea. A strip thin as reprieve. Hallie let out a breath he didn't remember trapping. He did not celebrate. You do not celebrate when the hardest parts are still ahead. Line her up, he said softly. Whatever we've got left goes there. Behind him, the men answered with silence, the most faithful kind. The reflection disappeared as the sun slid behind the world. The shard of mirror went dull, an ordinary piece of glass again. The cockpit dimmed to the color of old ash. The pencil lines on the frame looked like the score marks of a man keeping tally against death. Hallie did not need the light now. He had the line in his hands. He lowered the nose just enough to trade height for reach. The aircraft shuddered, then steadied, obedient to gravity and hope. Somewhere inland, a radio tower listened to a sky it could no longer hear. Somewhere out at sea, waves kept their conversation with the wind. Between them, one plane, held together by bolts and stubbornness, searched for a strip of earth wide enough to forgive a mistake. The last of the sun bled into the horizon and went out. Night gathered. With it came another kind of pressure, the kind that squeezes thought until it makes mistakes or makes miracles. And the darkness, patient and absolute, waited to see which kind they would make. The night was no longer silent. It was filled with the soft moan of wind slicing across metal, the creak of wings that no longer trusted the air, and the steady groan of a machine held together by will. Inside the bomber, darkness ruled. Only a faint red glow from the emergency light painted the cabin, turning every face into a ghost. They were still alive. But barely. Flight Lieutenant Hallie leaned forward, his hands glued to the controls, his eyes fighting the blur that came with exhaustion. His vision swam between darkness and memory, between duty and disbelief. The mirror had given them direction before sunset, but now the world was black again, and the sun, their one guide, had sunk beneath the edge of the world. For the first time in hours, he couldn't see his mark. He tried to remember the last clear line he'd drawn before the light died, the final position of the gleam. If they'd held it true, their heading should have brought them toward the coastline. But without stars or compass, it was guesswork again. And in the belly of the plane, men were starting to lose faith. "Phil's down to fumes, sir," called the engineer. His voice cracked, a sound halfway between a report and a plea. Hallie didn't answer. "What's the plan?" the gunner demanded. "We can't just drift till morning. We'll be floating over enemy lines out of gas, waiting to die." "Keep your head," Hallie muttered, his tone low but sharp. "Head, we've been flying blind for hours," the gunner snapped. "We should have gone down back there, saved ourselves from this." "Enough!" The single word cut through the cabin, the kind of word only a man on the brink could say without raising his voice. Silence followed, heavy as lead. Hallie stared out the cracked cockpit window. There was nothing, no light, no stars, only the dull smear of clouds against darkness. The desert below was invisible, but he could feel it vast, patient, waiting. He took a slow breath, forcing calm into lungs that wanted to shake. "We stay level," he said. We keep altitude. If we go down, it'll be by choice, not fear. The crew obeyed, though the silence that followed wasn't respect, it was despair. Minutes dragged. The bomber trembled with every shift of air. A faint metallic tick came from the dying engine, like the heartbeat of a failing animal. Halley felt every sound in his bones. Every vibration was a question, how much longer? He reached for the map, though he already knew it was useless. The lines meant nothing now, paper ghosts of a world that required instruments to exist. He traced his finger over the rough coordinates where he thought they'd been when the compass broke. Then he looked ahead, into the black. The sound of the wind grew louder, whispering through bullet holes in the fuselage. It sounded like voices, echoes of every man who had vanished over this same desert, swallowed by dust and distance. He blinked hard once, twice. His good eye burned from fatigue. The wound on his cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. He could feel dried blood cracking when he moved his jaw. Behind him, Sergeant Allen's pencil scraped over the chart. "If the mirror trick held straight, we should be near the coast by now," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "But without stars, there's no way to verify," Halley said quietly. "Then we wait for the sun." A murmur rippled through the crew. Disbelief, frustration. "Wait for the sun," the gunner repeated, half laughing, half mad. "At this rate, we'll be out of fuel before dawn." Halley turned his head slightly. "Then we'll glide. You think we can glide 30 miles? Maybe less," he said, "if we've held course." The gunner let out a dry laugh that ended as a cough. If always if. But no one else spoke. Even in the dim red light, Halley could see it, the hollow-eyed wariness, the raw hunger for direction, for certainty, for anything that wasn't waiting. He adjusted the throttle, listening to the engine's groan. "We'll ration what's left," he said quietly. "No more adjustments unless we drop below 2,000 feet. The engineer nodded, pale under the flicker of light. Allen folded his map, the sound brittle in the silence. The bomber held its altitude, barely. Outside, clouds gathered, thick and grey, swallowing even the faint outline of moonlight. The air grew colder. Moisture streaked the window glass, not rain, but condensation, a whisper of higher humidity. Somewhere out there unseen, the sea was close. Halley's heart tightened. If they were right, if the sun's last position had truly pointed them west, they might yet live to see the morning. He couldn't say that aloud. Hope, he'd learned, was dangerous when spoken. He looked at the faint reflection in the cracked glass, his own face pale, tired, one eye swollen, one burning with purpose. The mirror had been his salvation once. It could be again. He reached into the pocket of his flight jacket and found the fragment, the same sliver of glass he'd saved before dusk. He turned it in his fingers, feeling the edge bite his skin. Even in darkness, it caught the faintest trace of glow from the control light. The surface flickered weakly. He whispered to it, almost under his breath. "Tomorrow, you'll show me the way again." Hours passed. The crew rotated shifts, but no one truly rested. The bomber became a prison of motion, every sound amplified, every silence unbearable. At one point, the gunner murmured a prayer. The words were quiet, unsure, the kind spoken not to heaven, but to memory. Halley listened, eyes half closed, counting the seconds until dawn. He thought of his father again, the man who had believed in light. The man who taught him that everything visible, every shadow and shimmer, could be measured if you looked long enough. Light never lies, his father had said. It just waits for someone patient enough to understand it. That patience was all Halley had left. By the time the eastern sky began to pale, the bomber was shaking from cold and fatigue. The fuel gauge hovered on 0. Every groan of the engine was a coin flip between life and silence. Halley watched as the first line of grey crept across the horizon, the faint promise of morning. He said softly. The navigator stirred. "Sir." "Mark the time." Allen looked at his watch. 4:42. Halley nodded. First light. They waited. The world outside brightened by degrees, blue into grey, grey into silver. And then, finally, the edge of the sun broke the horizon, spilling thin light across the clouds. The cockpit came alive with colour again, dull bronze reflected on metal, soft glow across the fractured glass. Halley reached for the shard of mirror and tilted it toward the rising sun. The beam struck it, sharp and perfect. It glinted across the cabin, landing exactly on one of the grease marks still visible on the frame. A perfect match, Alan stared. That's the same mark you made yesterday. Hallie nodded slowly. It means we're still true. The crew gathered behind him, drawn to the light like men to fire. The reflection held steady. The plane hadn't drifted. Against all odds, through darkness, through storms, through fear, they'd held course. Sweet mercy, the engineer whispered. You did it. Hallie didn't answer. He simply watched the beam tremble with the vibration of the engine, his hands steady on the controls. Outside, the desert had changed color, no longer gold, but pale and ghostly in the dawn, and far beyond the shimmering dunes, the horizon had shifted again. A faint band of silver stretched where sky met earth. Water. He couldn't say it yet, but the sight hit him like oxygen after drowning. For the first time since the fight began, Hallie allowed himself a breath that didn't hurt. They were close. The sun rose higher, the light brightening, the reflections multiplying across the cabin. Every surface became a mirror, every shimmer a compass. The radio operator gave a startled cry. Sir, I'm getting signal. Hallie turned sharply. Say again. I swear it, sir, faint, but it's there. The man twisted the dial, static crackling like fire. A few broken syllables cut through the noise, an accent, a call sign, a number. Then it was gone again. But it was enough. Signal means proximity. Alan breathed. We're within range of bass frequencies. Hallie nodded once. His voice came calm, steady. Then we're almost home. He glanced down at the mirror one last time, its reflection dancing on the worn metal frame. And somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, he whispered, You've done it again, old friend. The light flared, bright and warm, as if answering back. The weak sun had barely lifted above the desert line when the first cough tore through the bomber's heart. The remaining engine sputtered, then caught again, a sick, uneven rhythm that made every man in the cabin look up. Hallie's hands gripped the yoke instinctively. He could feel it in the bones of the plane, the vibration, the uneven pulse. It wasn't just the fuel, the right engine was giving up. The propeller shuddered like it was fighting the air itself. Engineer, he called. Report. Oil pressure's falling, sir. She won't last long. Hallie's jaw clenched. How long? The engineer hesitated. Minutes, maybe less if we climb. They couldn't climb. They couldn't descend. They could only hold on. The bomber trembled again, a deep metallic moan that rolled through its ribs. Every screw, every rivet, every strip of aluminum seemed to be asking the same question: how much longer can we endure this? The crew had no answer. The morning light painted the desert in soft gold. But inside the aircraft it felt like dusk, the red of warning lights, the dark shapes of men watching death crawl closer. Alan leaned over his map again, though he knew there was nothing more it could tell him. If we're still on heading, we should be crossing over friendly lines any minute. Hallie didn't look at him. His eyes were on the horizon, where the shimmer of heat began to change shape. The faint silver he'd seen earlier was clearer now, a thin band of blue glinting between dunes. The sea, but distance in the desert was deceit. A mirage could fool even the most desperate man. Is it real? Alan asked, almost whispering. Hallie's good eye flickered. Catching a faint change in color, the blue stayed even as they moved, not bending with the sand. It's real, he said. It's water. A pulse of hope ran through the crew, brief and sharp. Then the engine sputtered again, and the moment was gone. The gunner cursed softly. We'll never make it to base. We'll make it somewhere, Hallie replied. Somewhere isn't good enough, sir. Somewhere's where men vanish. Hallie didn't answer. He stared at the broken gauges, the flickering needles, the useless compass still spinning as if mocking them. He wanted to believe they could glide the last few miles, but the altitude was dropping, the sound of the wind thickening. Alan, he said suddenly. Take a look out portside. What do you see? The navigator pressed his face against the glass. Sand dunes. Then darker ridges, maybe cliffs. Hard to say from this height. Cliffs mean coastline, Hallie said. And coastline means home. The engineer's voice cracked through the intercom. Fool zero, sir. We're on fumes. Halley exhaled slowly, steadying his voice. Then we make every second count. The aircraft's frame rattled violently. Metal screamed as one of the engine mounts strained under the torque. The sound cut through the cabin like a cry of pain. "Pressure's gone!" The engineer shouted. "We're losing oil completely." "Feather the prop," Halley ordered. "Don't let her tear herself apart." The man obeyed, pulling the lever. The failing propeller slowed, then stopped, blades catching the light for a moment before freezing. The sudden silence from that side of the plane was worse than the noise. The bomber began to yaw left, dragging through the air unevenly. Halley fought it, adjusting the trim, muscles burning as he tried to keep the nose level. They were down to one engine, barely, and the sea was still too far. Minutes stretched thin. The landscape below was changing now, the dunes breaking apart into stony ridges. Patches of dark earth and rock shimmered through the haze. Alan's voice came, trembling. "Sir, I think we're nearing the escarpment. The coast should be just beyond that ridge." "How high?" Halley asked. "Not high enough." Halley's knuckles whitened around the controls. The engine's cough grew weaker, its pitch lowering like a dying heartbeat. "Prepare for glide," he said calmly. The words settled like final orders. No one argued. They began to drop. Not a fall, not yet, just a long, slow surrender. The engine finally gave one last cough and stopped. The sudden quiet filled every ear. The only sound left was the wind whispering through the fuselage. Halley adjusted the trim again, feeling the shift in weight. The bomber leveled, gliding through the still air, a wounded bird with wings spread wide. "Keep her nose down," Alan said quietly, instinctively guiding. "I know," Halley replied, eyes locked forward. "We'll ride her as far as she'll take us." The altimeter needle barely moved, but the ground was climbing fast. The dunes gave way to cliffs, and beyond them, shining faintly in the growing light. The endless silver, blue of the Mediterranean. They had made it to the edge. But there was nowhere to land. The cliffs rose sharp and jagged, a wall of stone between them and salvation. The air here was rough, rolling with warm updrafts and pockets of turbulence. The bomber shook violently as it hit one. "Hold her," Alan shouted. Halley's arm strained. The yoke jerked in his hands, metal creaking in protest. The plane dipped, then steadied, catching a thin current of air. The cliffs rushed closer, dark, towering shapes that filled the cockpit windows. "Too close!" the gunner yelled. Halley angled slightly, feeling the edge of lift return.